did you want to give an update? Do you have a personal update to give? Hi guys, you're probably surprised to see me, so just know that I'm just as surprised that I finally sat down to make a video. It was a very spontaneous decision, and let's see if that motivation or whatever it is gonna be enough for me to actually record it and then edit it and then publish it, because there are some videos that were filmed earlier this year and never saw the light of day. But today I just thought I would sit down and give you a little bit of a language learning update, given that 2024 is coming to an end and I have not made a single video this year so far. So there's quite a lot to update you on. As far as why I haven't been making videos, honestly, just because I didn't feel like it. No one really tells you what your uploading schedule should look like when there's wars, when there's genocide going on in the world, and those things don't seem to be stopping anytime soon. And I have tried making videos, I have thought about making videos many times. I have upgraded some of my equipment thinking that that would also motivate me to go back on YouTube. But sometimes, you know, all it takes is just like one news article or one Instagram reel or whatever for you to start questioning, does anyone even need my silly language learning videos? Is that even something that I should be spending my energy on? I still don't have answers to all those questions, but I've tried not making videos for over a year, and now I'm back to making videos at least sporadically, and let's just see how that goes. And as far as whether I'm back or not, I honestly don't really know. I haven't been making videos in a while, so I do have some things to share. So a couple of days ago, I kind of started thinking about what I would want to talk about. I sat down and wrote a couple of scripts or video plans, and if I manage to film, edit and publish all of them, then you will have at least 3 or 4 videos in the next month or so. Let me just first give you a little overview of what my language learning looked like in the end of 2023, which was when I stopped making videos. If you watched my channel prior to my disappearance from it, you probably remember that in 2023 I was focusing mainly on 3 languages: Spanish, Italian, and Greek. And I think it's fair to say that Greek was my #1 priority at that time. But somewhere around November or December of 2023, I was getting increasingly frustrated with 2 things when it comes to my Greek. My lack of progress, but also a lack of resources that I could use as a beginner and also enjoy using. And I feel like I can tolerate 1 or 2 things. Like, there are difficult languages like, you know, Japanese or German, but you have a ton of resources, even as a beginner, to use. And then there are languages like Greek that are both difficult and also somewhat lacking in terms of resources. And after, you know, some back and forth, I decided to give myself a break from Greek. I wanted to go back to one of my stronger languages so that I could do all those things that I missed doing when I was focusing on Greek, like listening to podcasts, maybe reading or trying to read books, watching YouTube videos, and so on. And so I decided to actually pick Korean, and that was the language that I started 2024 with. I would probably say that when it comes to Korean, I am like at a B1 level. Basically, my level right now is not what it used to be back when I lived in Korea in, say, like 2017, 2018, when it was probably at its highest. And when it comes to Korean, my goals always are to get my listening to a level where I can listen to native podcasts, watch YouTube videos, watch documentaries, and things like that. And then my second goal is to start reading books in Korean. And when it comes to podcasts, I pretty quickly realized that native podcasts are still way out of reach for me. So I decided to focus on podcasts for like intermediate learners of Korean. And honestly, this time around, it was much easier to do because there's a lot of new YouTube channels and new podcasts that simply, I feel like, didn't exist back in like 2016 or 2017 when I was focusing on Korean the most. And then when it comes to reading, I actually did make some progress because this year I read my very first book in Korean. that was not a children's book, a manhwa book, what else? Like a graded reader. It was an actual book by Keiko Higashina, who is a Japanese author that I quite enjoy. He writes in the genre of like crime and mystery, and I have read quite a lot of books by him in English. And last year I also read a book by him translated into Italian. So this year I read a book called Pominomnin Sarine Bam, if I remember correctly. It was the first time I read it, so I haven't read it in any other language, and I don't even think it's translated into English at least. But yeah, I felt like it was the perfect choice, because even though reading in Korean is a bit more exhausting, you know, mentally than reading in other languages like Spanish or Italian, because the stories were so short, I feel like it allowed me to, you know, keep going and just always be engaged. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it was a good choice overall. I really enjoyed the book. I enjoyed the experience of reading in Korean, and I was 100% sure that after I am done with my first book in Korean, I would start reading more and more books. At least that was the plan. But here's where I shot myself in the foot. When I was choosing what to read next after finishing that book, I decided to read a book that I had already listened to as an audiobook a couple of years ago. I usually know myself, I'm not a rereader. It doesn't matter what language it is. I do not like rewatching things. I do not like rereading things. So why did I think it was going to be a good idea? I don't know. I think I really got inspired by all the people on the internet that I see, you know, rereading like Harry Potter or The Little Prince in like all the different languages after they already have read it in their mother tongue. And I thought, yeah, I could do something like that. Korean is still challenging, so knowing the content will definitely help. And here's where I kind of realized that for me personally, the story itself, not knowing what's going to happen next, is more important than the level. I don't really care if being familiar with the story helps me understand, you know, the language of the book better, because being familiar with the story kills the joy of reading for me personally. This was a hard lesson to learn, because basically it cost me my motivation to continue reading in Korean. So here's my first language learning lesson of the year. Just because it works for everybody else, or at least for a lot of people, doesn't mean that it will work for me. And I have been in this language learning game for long enough to know what I like and don't like, and if only I also listened to myself, that would save me a lot of time and frustration. Another language I was trying to go back to kind of at the same time as Korean was Polish. I have such a weird relationship with Polish because I feel like this language is very dear to my heart, but also the emotional connection I feel to the language does not at all correspond to how much time I spend on Polish. So somewhere I think around January, I decided that maybe 2024 would be the year when I finally make a lot of progress in Polish. But this time I decided to get some external accountability, and I found not one but actually 2 tutors, and at some point I was having up to 3 classes a week, which I thought was really fun. In between my classes, I was also doing a lot of listening and reading. One of my favorite podcasts is Polskie Daily. I think it's even one of my top podcasts on Spotify this year or something like that. The creator of this podcast, I actually love everything that she does. She also creates YouTube videos. She makes Instagram content. She also has graded readers that I love. I actually read one graded reader by her that legit made me cry. And when I was retelling the story to my husband, he was like, "Are you sure you were talking about a graded reader? Like, it's not some kind of European indie movie?" And I was like, yeah, it's a graded reader. It's probably the best graded reader I've ever read in any language. And it's actually the only graded reader this year that I counted towards my book count, because usually I don't do that with graded readers, but that one, I'm talking more about this one graded reader that it took me like a week to finish than about everything else that I was doing for a couple of months in Polish. But yeah, I was also watching a lot of YouTube, Easy Polish, of course, but there's also another really good YouTube channel called Think in Polish that I highly recommend to anyone who's learning the language. So at some point I was on a roll, and I was like very positive that Polish was here to stay for a bit longer than it did. But then what ended up happening is that I got super anxious about something in my personal life, and I think that anxiety kind of made me lose a little bit of interest when it comes to getting input in Polish. But for me personally, I don't really view classes as a way to learn something new. I view classes as a way to practice the vocabulary or the grammar or like phrases that I heard or read somewhere else, and then I bring it to class. I try to use those things and I get feedback from the teacher. That I think is what works best for me. And when I don't get that input outside of the classroom, the classes themselves start feeling like a burden and a little bit like a waste of time. And so at some point I had to message my tutors and be like, hey, I need to take a break. But any social interaction like that also causes me a lot of like shame or like discomfort, and because of that, it was just kind of like negative feelings all around. I was already anxious because of like some personal problems, and then I got like anxious because I had to tell my tutors that, hey, it's not you, it's me, I just need a break right now. And as a result, I was just like, okay, you know what, Polish, I will be back. I know 100% it is a language that I want to learn and that I can see myself fluent in at some point, but this some point is getting postponed again. And so the second lesson that I learned this year is that classes can be a source of external accountability, but sometimes under certain circumstances, they can also become a burden. Okay, my next language is Spanish, and I'll try to make this one short because there's not really much to report. So something that I don't think I talked about a lot back in 2023 on my channel is that in September, I started this challenge where for 99 days, I wanted to read in Spanish every single day. The idea is that if you start on the 23rd or the 24th of September and you do something every day for 100 days or for 99 days, depending on when you start, you will finish that challenge on the 31st of December. I did something similar in 2022 for Polish. I did that challenge in 2023 for Spanish, for reading in Spanish specifically, and I'm doing it now for Italian. But going back to last year's challenge, I successfully finished it. I didn't read every single day. I think I skipped about 14 days or so out of 99, but it was not consecutive days, so I do consider the challenge a success. And I think in that time I finished 10 books, 2 or 3 of which were audiobooks, and then everything else was just normal books. I was pretty satisfied with that result, and so going into 2024, I kind of knew that I was not gonna spend as much time on Spanish in the new year as I did in 2023. But I did at some point try to find a tutor for just having conversations in Spanish on italki, which I actually really enjoyed. I really liked the setup because what we would do is we would pick a video or podcast to watch or to listen to. Sometimes it would be something that she suggested, other times it was something that I suggested. We would watch it separately before class, and then during class we would just discuss that. And I feel like for me, it is a perfect setup just because while being exposed to that content, I get to learn any relevant vocabulary, especially if it's on something like very specific. For example, I remember one video that we discussed was on what it feels like to have Alzheimer's. So yeah, you kind of get exposed to like the vocabulary to be able to talk about that topic. But you also actually, hear an opinion of someone who is going through this situation, and then that gives you even more to talk about. So not just in terms of the language, but also in terms of the content, But the reason why I didn't continue with those classes was because it was at that time that I was having a lot of anxiety about my dog's health. And so those classes, or just language learning in general, was just not something that I necessarily cared about at that time. And when it comes to books, right, again, I read more than 10 books overall last year in Spanish, so this year I wasn't really trying to focus on reading in Spanish, and as a result I have only read 1 book in Spanish so far. And I guess the third lesson of this year is that classes really work best for me when they are combined with input that I get elsewhere. Let's now talk about Italian, because I feel like it is the language, no, it definitely is the language that I've had the most progress in this year. I actually didn't really know if I wanted to focus on Italian this year. It just kind of happened randomly when one day, I think it was around April, I was watching one of Joe's video where she was talking about Babel Live, maybe comparing Babel Live with Lingota, and I had used Lingota before for my Spanish many times. I've taken over like 50 classes with them, I think, but I had never really heard of Babbel Live before that. And if you're not familiar with what Babbel Live is, you might have heard of their app Babbel, which is one of those generic language learning apps like Duolingo, Memrise, I don't know, Speakly, something like that, right? But Babbel Live is not necessarily connected to the app. It's just language classes that you buy kind of through this gym membership like subscription model when you pay for 1 or 3 or 6 months or maybe even 12 months. And during that time that you paid for, you get to attend as many online classes as you want for any of the languages that they offered, which in their case was English, Spanish, French, German, and Italian. And because Italian happened to be one of those languages that it's hard to find a similar deal for, I just decided to try it. And as a result, I ended up buying a 3-month subscription and taking 49 classes during those 3 months. As always with me, I decided that if I'm taking classes, I also want to be doing something outside of the classroom, which in my case is almost always reading. So I decided to go back to reading in Italian. And when it comes to Italian, I wasn't as confident of a reader as I am, for example, in Spanish. 2023 was the first year when I actually started reading in Italian, and I only read 2 books. So this year I decided to pick up my 3rd book. After that, I read a couple more, and at some point I knew I wanted to do my 100-day reading challenge in Italian this year, which is what I have been doing since the end of September. And so far I have read 9 or 10 books for the challenge, and then there were, I think, about 3 books that I read before starting the challenge this year. So this is actually something I'm kind of proud of, but despite being my biggest pride this year, Italian is probably also one of my biggest frustrations. And that is because looking back, I really regret the way I approached learning Italian. When I started learning it, I had already had a pretty good foundation in Spanish, and so studying grammar felt more boring than it normally does for me, because I felt like a lot of things were just very, very similar to Spanish. And I guess another thing was that even without doing all this studying, I could already understand quite a lot. And since I couldn't make myself do any kind of formal like grammar textbook study, I decided to just focus on input. I was learning vocabulary independently from all of the content that I was consuming. But besides that, grammar books, drills, exercises, stuff that I normally do on the side, even though I'm primarily an input-based learner, I basically neglected all of that when it comes to Italian. And again, the similarity between Spanish and Italian allowed me to sort of bypass studying grammar, but only in terms of comprehension. But when it comes to my production skills, this is where the frustration starts, because at this point, even though I've had quite a lot of exposure, even after reading 15 or however many books I have so far read in Italian, the gap between my comprehension and my production is huge. And mind you, I do understand that usually it is normal for your production skills to lag behind your comprehension. But there is something to be said when your comprehension gets closer and closer to C1 and C2. At least that's what I have seen some of the books that I have successfully read in Italian rated as, and your production skills are still somewhere between A1 and A2. I know there are things that I could be doing and that I should probably be doing to try to bridge that gap, but honestly, it is also really frustrating as someone who can already pick up a super interesting book and read it to go back and try to like nail down the basics of the language. Looking back, I think I would much rather do all that boring stuff as a beginner, obviously combined with other activities, and then move on from it and then never touch grammar stuff again. I feel like somewhere after B1 or like maybe B2, I kind of just like don't even care about studying grammar anymore. I care about growing my vocabulary. I care about learning new expressions that might involve grammar, but that's not through formal study. And I think that's how I want to do it from now on, so that I don't have to go back to A1 and A2 level grammar when I can already understand like C1 level content in the language. So I guess my next lesson of the year is to not neglect grammar as a beginner. Again, this might just be a personal preference, but it's something that I believe very strongly now. Let's talk about Japanese, another language that I feel like I haven't really talked that much about on my channel, even though one of my most watched videos is about Japanese resources. So I think it was somewhere between putting Polish on hold and starting focusing on Italian that I decided to try to at least refresh my knowledge of Japanese. Which, to be honest, there's not a lot of knowledge there. By the time that I stopped studying it back in like September of 2022, I was a solid N5. I wasn't really someone who needed to study the contents of N5 because I'm pretty sure if I had the chance to take the JLPT at that time, I would have passed N5. But I was just starting to get to the N4 content at that time. And so this year, when I decided to go back to it, my first goal was to refresh what I had known but probably forgotten. And I did quite a lot of stuff. I was using Lingo Deer to basically refresh again my existing knowledge. I was trying different graded readers. I also started my second Genki textbook because I had finished the first one before, but it was really hard for me to get into some kind of a routine. Like my studying was really sporadic. But at some point I did manage to start studying consistently, like 3, 4, 5 times a week. And I think I did that for about 2 or 3 weeks, like really consistently. And the funniest thing is that it actually took achieving some sort of consistency with Japanese that I realized that I actually don't want to study Japanese. The whole time, like whenever I would sit down, whatever I was doing, whether it was reading or listening, whether it was just studying the textbook, every time I would sit down, I had this voice in the back of my head telling me that I was just wasting my time, that I did not have a good reason to be studying that language. And Japanese is not an easy language, so I feel like if you were to try to learn it, you do have to have a good reason. And so many people that are learning it, like especially here in the US, are doing it because they're in love with like Japanese like pop culture, right? So they watch things, they read things, they listen to things. I didn't have any of those reasons. When I signed up for Japanese classes when I was living in Moscow, it was like late 2021, and it was when the restrictions, you know, around like the pandemic were getting a little bit looser, and I just wanted to get out of my house and just be around people. And so I found those like Japanese classes and I thought, you know, why not? So the goal was actually, you know, to be around people who like doing something that I do, not to learn Japanese. And once I realized that I don't actually have a great reason to study Japanese, I decided that I shouldn't just stop learning it, but I should also put as much effort as I can to not pick it back up anytime soon. So for now, I do not even consider it to be one of my target languages. If I like retire in 30 years and I decide to start learning Japanese again, that's perfectly fine. But at least in the next 5 years, I do not want to hear myself even as much as talk about learning Japanese. And so the next lesson of this year is that if it's not a 100% yes, it's a 300% no. And as sad as I am to say this, I think Greek right now is going to be in the same sort of exile. I do want to learn Greek eventually, but again, right now I do not have a good reason to learn it. I do not have the motivation that it takes to learn such a difficult language with such few resources. And so for now, Japanese and Greek are going to be 2 languages that I'm going to be actively avoiding. The last language I wanted to talk about is German, and I think this is probably the first time I'm talking about German on this channel. I do consider it to be a new addition to my language family, but at the same time it's not entirely correct because I did have a couple of semesters of German back when I was an undergrad student, so it was like around 2013 or 2014, I believe. However, I do not want to say that I didn't learn much because right now, for example, I'm just kind of trying to start from scratch, but I do notice that I know a lot of the things that the book has already. But at the same time, I also acknowledge that the way that I approached those German classes that I had in university was extremely inefficient. It was like basically the definition of how you should not try to learn a language. So let's say we would have a class every Thursday, and I would go to class and I would be super engaged in class, and then I would go back home and I would not do anything German related until basically Wednesday night of next week, when I would sit down to do homework. And obviously at that point I would not remember anything that we had studied the week before. So that was kind of my German journey. So why did I decide to start studying German again? I think even though I did not continue studying it on my own after I was done with my university classes, I always knew that German was a language that I wanted to learn. It was just a matter of when. There were even a lot of instances where people would recommend like German shows to me, for example, and I would be like, no, I'm not watching anything now because I know that one day I will start learning it again, and this is when I'm going to be watching all those shows and movies and whatnot. This summer I also happened to travel to both Austria and Germany, and that was a huge catalyst. So far, learning German has been really fun. There's so many resources. It's just kind of amazing how many podcasts, how many YouTube channels there are, graded readers, all that stuff. So I've been really enjoying that, but there definitely have been a couple of hiccups, and that is usually when I make myself stick to one resource. It sounds like the type of advice that makes sense, to not spread yourself too thin and just find something that works and stick to it until you finish it. But I just kind of realized that sometimes what happens to me is that I will find something, let's say a podcast, and I listen to it for weeks and I love it. I start paying for their Patreon, and my intention is to finish all of the episodes that they have. And then somewhere around maybe episode 60, I would just get sick of it. I have not heard the rest yet, but I also have no interest in hearing more episodes from them. But because I remember these positive emotions that I was experiencing when I just found the podcast, I kind of make myself, stick to it and actually like finish it or listen to it again. It has happened to me with so many different resources, not just podcasts, link mini stories, which I think they have 60. I listened to 27, and after that, I literally would have to like force myself to listen to more. And whenever I force myself to do anything, it just obviously creates a lot of negative emotions. And then sometimes, or a lot of the times, it actually makes me not want to learn the language. But as soon as I gave myself that permission to find the resource I enjoy, use it for as long as I enjoy it, and then leave and never look back unless I actually want to, things have been going great. So hopefully that's one of the languages I am able to stick with long term. So this is how my 2024 has gone so far in terms of language learning. I would love to hear anything that you would like to share in terms of language learning or personal updates or anything else pretty much. Thank you so much for staying subscribed and for watching this video until the end. I know it's very rambly. I just felt like I had a lot to share. I do have a plan for another couple of videos that I'm planning to film right after I film this one. So hopefully you will be seeing those sometime soon. And yeah, to repeat myself, thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye!